Hello, and welcome to More Intelligent Tomorrow, a wide-ranging exploration of the potential impact of AI on the world around us, as envisioned by the future heroes of the human and machine intelligence revolution. Can AI save world's languages from dying before it's too late? We'll discuss this and more with William OGrady on today's episode. And now, your host, Ben Taylor.
Well, William, I'm really excited to have you on the show. I appreciate you making time.
Thank you, Ben. I really hope for the sake of two disciplines that we can have the sort of conversation that needs to be had. The two disciplines being AI and linguistics.
Yeah, I'm really excited to get into it. I think one of the things I love the most about your discipline is it's so relatable. So anyone who's been a parent has taught a child, and I think you appreciate that more than most, why that's such a miracle.
It is. And of course, when you see a miracle, your first urge is to try to understand it. And that's exactly what we're doing in linguistics and making progress bit by bit.
So reading your book, the thing I'm reminded of is I was really fascinated with this concept of focus. So while a child is learning a language, it's really important that there's a focus, whether you're talking to a child or you're directing attention to an object. So I guess a quick question is, can a child learn a language listening to a radio? So if I'm in a black person,
right. Yeah, exactly. If only, right? The child couldn't do it any more than you and I can do it. The key to learning a language is to hear utterances and to be able to match them with a corresponding situation, right? So you sort of have to know what the meaning is that's being expressed in order to figure out how it's expressed by words of a particular form arranged in a particular way. You listen to the radio, you get the forms, but you have no idea what they correspond to. You don't know what the meaning of the individual parts, syllables, morphemes, words are. And under those circumstances, you might be able to memorize a few chunks like a parrot, but you would never be able to speak the language.
That's fascinating. Before we dive into the AI discussion, I wanted to hit on these dying languages quickly. So you're calling from Hawaii. Is Hawaiian a language that's at risk at dying? What are some of the top languages you think about that may go away if we don't do something to capture them?
Well, Ben, it's a very long list. About half the world's languages are currently endangered. So there's around 7,000 languages in the world, and about 3,500 of them are endangered right now. Looking forward into the rest of this 21st century, the more pessimistic estimates suggest that by the end of the 21st century, 90% of the world's languages will have been lost. So there are communities now, of course, who are very concerned about the fact that their languages are disappearing because language is an important part of your identity. It's a way to bring a community together, common cultural practice. But it's very difficult to save a language once it gets to the point where it's critically endangered and the only fluent speakers are elderly. Hawaii provides a model of what can be done. There's been a lot of success here with the use of immersion schools for young kids. And I work on a language called Jeju or Jejuo, which is spoken in Korea. It too is critically endangered. The only speakers are elderly, and they're trying now to revitalize and preserve Jejuo as well, again with the usual challenges. And I will say it's more than just a commitment that's required. It takes a lot of money to revitalize a language as well. You've got to set up a school system. You've got to hire teachers. You've got to develop curriculum materials. You need to provide incentives for students to study the language at universities so that they can become teachers and so on. People often don't think of these practical aspects of it when they get started. But the single most important thing is that when you do get a bunch of kids together in an immersion classroom, that the teachers speak to them as much as possible, because the kids are relying just on the input they're getting in the classroom to learn the language and become fluent in it. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but I personally believe that this is one of the areas in which AI could really do some good, and that would be to develop chatbots that would provide kids with the opportunity for one-on-one conversations. Remember, the one-on-one conversation is really important for language learning. It's a big job, though. We have the languages in which they've made the most progress developing chatbots for language learning are English and other popular European languages, naturally. But those are not the endangered languages. Those languages are doing just fine. It's the endangered languages that really need the help.
This is fascinating. I think a lot of people don't think about dying languages. If I talk to random people off the street, they don't think about it. But there's something that should be heartbreaking because it's almost like burning art, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
destroying something because I can capture art and I can take digital
Right.
photos of it.
Right.
But how can you digitize a language?
Right.
So you mentioned AI. Is that something that you guys think about or people are thinking about in the field? How do you
Yeah.
digitize these dying languages as quickly as possible? Do you record a conversation? Does it have to be
Yeah.
a video conversation? What are some tricks or ideas you have?
Yeah. Well, that would be the practice, of course, is to get enough data together of actual conversations. Could be conversations between grandparents and their grandchildren, or grandparents speaking to each other. I'm saying grandparents here because typically it's only the older people who are fluent in the language. But I know from what we've been trying to do on Jeju Island that we don't currently have enough data to be able to do any sort of deep learning that would give us a fluent chatbot. So one of the big challenges is to try to expand the amount of data that we have so that eventually, using the techniques of deep learning, which I think are very exciting and interesting, we might be able to develop chatbots, and that would be, I think, a turning point, not only in the field of AI, but in the field of language revitalization as well. It would bring hope to a lot of communities that otherwise would have no reason to hope.
So, will I be able to understand English 1,000 years from now? When you think about dialects changing and words
Yeah,
evolving,
no,
can you pause a
right.
language or is it always evolving?
It's always evolving. And one of the best ways for you to answer that question is to look at English as it was 1,000 years ago. Pick up a copy of Beowulf, the Old English classic, and see how much of it you can understand, right? Or you can even go online and hear people reading Beowulf in the original Old English, and you won't understand a word. Go to Middle English, the time of Chaucer, and you'll be able to catch 50, 60% of what's being said. You listen to it for a while, you'll be able to pick up a bit more. But the language marches on, some faster than others. The ones that tend to change more slowly are the ones that are spoken in small communities. The ones that tend to change faster are the ones that are spoken over multiple communities, and English is a good example of that.
And the next question you lead me to is, I think it'd be great to criticize some of the current AI research. So GPT-3 is getting a lot of attention right now.
Sure is.
And if you talk to people in your discipline, if you tell them that model is built with 175 billion parameters, that can feel quite intimidating.
Yep.
But you and I talked about this offline. What do you think about GPT versus how language actually works? Are we taking inspiration from a bird and we're building a plane?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy, to make here. So you got to decide what it is you think you're doing on the AI side. Are you building a machine or are you trying to understand something, right? Or both. So it seems to me that the people who are doing the GPT-2 work are trying to build a machine that will compose grammatical, coherent sentences, create paragraphs and essays. They're not trying to explain how human beings do that or how human language works. They're basically trying to find a workaround so that you could build sentences and paragraphs and even essays and potentially someday even books without having to speak the language or even to be a good writer yourself. So I think that's the context in which we have to look at this. What are they trying to do? Now, if you look at it from that perspective, then it is impressive. And I know a lot of linguists are going to disagree with me about this. But here's what impresses me about what they've been able to do. They have been able to put together words with the right form, in the right order, to produce grammatical sentences. To some degree, the grammatical sentences, when arranged one after the other, are coherent. And that's impressive. And it's wrong to say that it's not impressive. Now, I always say, linguists are like the ornithologists. They want to know how the birds fly. And there was a time in which a lot of other people were curious about that too. Everyone from Leonardo da Vinci to the Wright brothers and beyond. But what happened was, along the way, trying to figure out how birds fly, they found another way to fly, which was to build a flying machine. And there are some similarities between what birds do and what flying machines do. Issues of lift and drag are relevant to bird flight just as they are to airplane flight. But basically, they're two different things, birds flying and airplanes flying. And what happened is they ended up building airplanes that were so superior to birds in terms of how fast they could fly, how much they could carry, their efficiency, and so on, that the question of how birds can fly sort of went to the side. And this is sort of typical of technology that takes its inspiration from nature, as in fact AI has done. You start off with something in nature that you see as important and useful. It might be a candle. You start thinking, how could I build one of those so that it would be better and more efficient? So you end up with an electric light bulb. And the electric light bulb is better than the candle. I mean, no one's lighting their home with candles, right? They're all using electric light bulbs. Same thing with flight. I mean, airplanes are better at flying than birds, but they do it in a different way. And the electric light bulb illuminates your room in a different way from a candle would do. So now we're into cognition, right? And we have software that can beat the best chess player in the world. We've had that software now for more than 20 years. We have software that can beat world champions in Jeopardy. That happened, several years ago as well. Now what we're getting is software for language that can do some things as well as some people, maybe even better than some people. And it's not going to stop.
Yeah.
It's going to get better and better and better. I mean, don't forget, 1903, the Wright brothers had that very first flight. And it was, they went 10 feet off the ground, traveled 120 feet, crash landed. Okay, that's 1903. Go ahead 66 years, and it's 1969. What happened in 1969? Man landed on the moon, right?
Yeah, which is unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And I look at some of the technologies out there now relevant to language, like I've been following if I can mention Google Translate, for example. And it's improved dramatically in the last several years. I was working on it there recently, trying to fool it. And I was able to. I was able to get it and make mistakes, but only by looking at really esoteric phenomena involving what we call scope, the way in which negatives interact with quantifiers. And I was able to get it to mistranslate English sentences. But it was doing a very good job with other things. And that wouldn't have been imaginable even 10 years ago. There's lots and lots of people who are going to say there are horrendous mistakes that Google Translate makes, or whatever other system you have. In fact, you go online and they have these website hilarious translation errors and so on. But it's getting better and better, and you've got to look at that trajectory. But no matter how good it gets, it doesn't mean that it's going to be a model of how human language works in the human brain, any more than the best airplane in the world is going to be a model for how a bird flies. There's still nature, and nature still needs to be understood.
I'm reminded of a question I wanted to ask you earlier. Which animal has the most impressive language? And would you say other animals have a language that's attached to the brain?
The animal with the most impressive language is sitting here talking to each other, right? It's us, right? We're the only ones that have language. Only humans have language. If you ask me, in which other animals have the most impressive systems of communication, I really couldn't answer. And the reason I couldn't answer, and the reason I don't think anyone could answer right now, is that we would need a metric, right, against which to evaluate and measure what their accomplishments are. I mean, you look at a video of the bee dance and how it's used to communicate to the other bees the direction in which they should fly to find the honey. I mean, it's amazing. The creatures that tiny, with brains the size of a little more than a pinhead, can do that. I mean, that's incredible, right? There are animals that communicate with each other via scent. There are languages that communicate with each other via posture, positioning, baring their teeth, and so on. Those are all examples of communication. Each is impressive in its own way when you think that they're all products of natural selection and evolution. But nothing compares to what you and I are doing right now.
One of the things I was thinking about when you were responding was this concept of pre-programming. So a baby zebra can run within a few minutes or a few hours of being born. Are humans pre-programmed to learn language?
Well, you've touched upon an interesting issue in linguistics. There is a very large group of people who would say yes. In fact, if you want an example of that, you go to Steven Pinker's book called The Language Instinct, right? And he makes the claim that children are born with an instinct for learning language. And then people like Noam Chomsky have sort of filled out what that instinct might be. It might be something called universal grammar, which is sort of an inborn cognitive system that gives children a huge head start on language by telling them, here are the types of syntactic categories you should be looking for: noun, verb, adjective. And here are the types of syntactic patterns, speaking roughly, that you should be looking for. Certain grammatical principles are already there, already inborn. So that's one way to go. The other way to go, which is sort of the way I prefer to go, is more an emergentist approach. So we treat language as a complex system. And we say that there are certain biases that lead children to proceed in one direction rather than another. So my examples involving processing, an example of a type of bias. And then the job is to try to see which idea works best for the types of languages that people speak and the types of languages that children learn. And this is an ongoing subject of debate and research within linguistics. But I think it's a line of research that people working in cognitive science and people working in AI need to be keeping an eye on, in part because it could be very relevant to their work, and in part because maybe they have something to say to us that would help us better understand the direction in which we should be going. And I'd love to have those types of conversations with people on the AI side.